Hello and welcome to my book review of Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Reni Eddo-Lodge. Like many people, I have been watching the Black Lives Matter movement rise up after the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis. I watched with adoration as rebels successfully outmaneuvered police, forcing them to flee, culminating in the burning down of the 3rd Precinct in Minneapolis. Since then, more and more uprisings have occurred across America and the world. These uprisings have been unsurprisingly met with brutal and violent suppression by police forces, which has started a serious conversation about the role of the police in society, with many calling for abolition of the police. With many people kindly posting reading lists on Twitter, and my university education coming to an end, I felt it was time to read some anti-racist literature rather than just Twitter. Though Twitter can be better for this stuff than you might think, I thought this book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, would be a good introduction, and I wanted to share my thoughts on it as well as talk about some of its key points, either to get you interested in buying the book or loaning from the library. Support your local libraries. I also thought it would be a good idea to introduce some of the concepts to those of you who may not have heard of this stuff before in any real detail. Plus, working on something helps me to remember what I've read far better. With all that said,
but let's just jump into it.
The first thing I want to say about this book is how great the cover is. To White People is written in a slight off-white colour and slightly indented into the white background. It is written by journalist Reni Eddo-Lodge, whose podcast called About Race I've already listened to in its entirety and would certainly recommend. In the preface, she explains how this book is a kind of follow-up to a blog post of hers that went viral in 2014 with the same title as the book. The post explained her feelings of frustration in conversations with white people about race. In the original post, she says, "I cannot continue to emotionally exhaust myself trying to get this message across, while also towing a very precarious line that tries not to implicate any one white person in their role of perpetuating structural racism, lest they character assassinate me." She also says, "I can't have a conversation with them about the details of a problem if they don't recognize that the problem exists." As a result of the post's popularity, black people messaged in saying it articulated how they felt too. But there was also a reaction from white people, self-flagellation and a plea to keep talking about race. Eddo-Lodge admits that, since then, she has done almost nothing but talk about race, because of the platform she now has. The aim of this book, she says, is to continue the conversation. It is important to note that Eddo-Lodge is from the UK, and so her analysis is through a UK-centric lens. As this is a book review, I will only give you a brief summary of the contents of the book, otherwise you might feel like you have no reason to read it. Eddo-Lodge gives an overview of the history of race relations in the UK, highlighting the systemic oppression of black and brown people by the government, racist white mobs, companies, the police, and even trade unions. She defines structural racism and explains how it is essential to our understanding of racism that we recognize how it manifests in more insidious ways than simply overt racism, such as racial slurs shouted by someone with a St. George's flag. She also explains how being colorblind about race is useless, as it ignores systemic racism and is often used to silence people speaking up about racism. She also talks about what white privilege is and how whiteness is wrongly considered the default for humans. She talks about accusations of reverse racism from the press, and how the powers that be have a vested interest in proliferating the idea that racism is individualistic and can go both ways. With the help of former BNP leader Nick Griffin, Eddo-Lodge shows what fear of a black planet looks like. Also mentioned is the idea of white feminism, which involves thinking and agitating in aid of a feminist perspective that lacks an intersectional analysis, particularly when it comes to discussions about race. She explains her own experiences in these feminist spaces and how the same is true in the media. In the chapter Race and Class, Eddo-Lodge talks about how people are often willing to reduce racial inequality to class inequality. She explains how the middle and upper classes are using a tactic of divide and rule to prevent class solidarity and fight amongst themselves. She also points out that anti-racism is a journey and you can't just skip to the end. Barack Obama is president. Racism is over. For Edo Lodge, anti-racist action involves the rejection of biased agendas and dishonest framing, and setting our own, and challenging structural racism. For white people in particular, she points out that racism is really a problem with white people, white anxiety, for example. Therefore, to challenge structural racism, white people must examine their own biases and speak to other white people about race, in the workplace, with your friends, etc. The version of the book I received has an additional chapter called Aftermath, which talks about the change in the discussion of race since the book's publishing. Edo Lodge says the conversation has shifted in a more anti-racist direction. She says that at the time, the things mentioned in this book felt quite radical, but now have become almost mainstream, though structural racism is far from ended. Since even this new chapter's release, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn was replaced as leader of the opposition by Keir Starmer.
You were the chosen one!
This represents a regression in electoral politics on issues of race. However, with the Black Lives Matter movement has come a move toward a more radical anti-racism, separate from the winding avenues and cul-de-sacs of electoral politics. Young anti-racists are looking for new ways to express their anger and contempt for colonial racial capitalism. What I've outlined so far is a summary of what this book talks about. If you want the full context and details behind some of the things mentioned so far, then it would be a good idea to pick up the book. However, I will now highlight some of the quotes I liked and go into a bit more detail about what they mean. Firstly, what is structural racism? Edo Lodge points out that we tell ourselves that racism is about moral values, when instead it is about the survival strategy of systemic power. This touches on how we often think of racism as merely acts of overt racism like shouting racial slurs, but racism can be more subtle than that. Furthermore, structural racism is not a bug, but a feature of systemic power. The ideology of white supremacy is how colonialism and slavery have been justified, and the institutions based on that ideology in the West have not changed significantly. It is essential to the continuation of capitalism. Edo Lodge explains, I choose to use the word structural rather than institutional because I think it is built into spaces much broader than our more traditional institutions. This means structural racism is pervasive throughout society. Structural racism is an impenetrably white workplace culture set by those people, where anyone who falls outside of the culture must conform or face failure. Structural is often the only way to capture what goes unnoticed: the silently raised eyebrows, the implicit biases, snap judgments made on perceptions of competency. Another quote I like is, in theory, nobody has a problem with anti-racism. In practice, as soon as people start doing anti-racist things, there is no end to the slew of commentators who are convinced anti-racists are doing it wrong, even among people who consider themselves to be progressive. This has been shown to be so very true in the last few months, with people like current leader of the opposition Keir Starmer coming out against the protesters who tore down the statue of colonizer and slave trader Edward Colston. Calls for police and prison abolition are laughed away as ridiculous suggestions. Protesters destroying property is considered violence and hurts the cause of the peaceful protesters. Attempts to include more people of colour in decision-making and positions of power and influence are called unfair by people who clearly already believe we live in a true meritocracy, and those in positions of power just happen to be white. Presumably this state of affairs makes sense to them, because they are white supremacists. As we challenge racist, Islamophobic stories regarding sexual abuse, we've also got to challenge patriarchy where we find it. One cannot be done effectively without the other. Intersectionality is of great importance, else you end up with more women prison guards. We should be rethinking the image we conjure up when we think of a working class person. Instead of a white man in a flat cap, it's a black woman pushing a pram. And, in the hands of the have-it-alls, the class and race of the have-nots are pitted against each other. So did I like the book? Yes, I did, if you couldn't already tell. Everything mentioned in this video explains why I enjoyed it and why I thought it says important things. I do, however, have one or two criticisms. The first is that her history lesson inexplicably skips over World War II. I'm not sure why. Perhaps she felt most people have enough of an education surrounding World War II for it not to be worth including. The second is that the interview she does with Nick Griffin is done out of a necessity to give someone the right to reply in free speech law. But with the inclusion of this interview, in which Nick gets to ramble on with his nonsense, I think Edo Lodge has earned the right to tear him apart limb from limb in a more devastating fashion than was demonstrated. On the other hand, it serves as a concise example of the ideas underpinning anti-immigrant white nationalist rhetoric. With that said, I would heartily recommend this book. It requires little to no prior knowledge and is very accessible. It comes from a British perspective. In the UK, when I think about my history education, issues of racism were only ever about segregation in America, with no reference to racism in the UK. As such, this book introduces history that the school curriculum often fails to teach us, which helps put into perspective the context of the actions of that time and provides context for what is happening today. Thank you for watching.